there has to be a change in behavioral attitudes in society, along with the concept that, well, I can go to heaven and they can go to heaven too. This concept has tremendous social implications. The concept has tremendous political implications. There were many of us, and I have to say myself because I was one of the naysayers, who in the 1980s believed very firmly and very absolutely the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, cannot make that one simple move that the Jewish world is crying out for and move the embassy to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. As we have discussed in prior weeks, when the official doctrine of the Catholic Church is used to grind the lenses instead of the Talmud, we spoke about the Talmud grinding lenses through which we view the Bible. If it is the doctrine of the Church that grinds those lenses, then Israel is read as the Church. And a New Testament means a new choosing of a new body, of a new corporate body, of a new people. A more advanced people. A people who aren't so ethnic and tribal. A people who are universal and all-embracing. And this is what the Church has always seen itself as being. And if one looks at the composition of the hierarchy through the Middle Ages and beyond, one could see a certain validity to this claim. There were the highest of the highborn nobles who bought their office, and there were, in fact or in theory, those who had the one avenue of upward mobility in this very stratified world of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance through the Church. And occasionally amongst the princes of the Church was one who was born to peasants, or at least maybe whose parents had been born to peasants, and who did not have much of a pedigree to get where they are. Of course, there were all sorts of deviations and corruptions and deviations from church doctrine and corruption in the Church, and we must, of course, understand that in the very authoritarian world of the European Middle Ages, there were corruptions and deviations amongst the rabbinate and rabbinical leaders as well. The only difference being that rabbis could marry in public instead of in secret. And they usually didn't have as many illegitimate children as the bishops did. But all of this was rife at the time, and all of this was happening. As we look at the development in the integrity of each of the religions, we see that there are two predominating schools of thought. There are always and in all times a voice of fanaticism. The voice of moderation, on the other hand, can only be heard, it seems, in those times where moderates seem to predominate. Where the fanatics have force, we will find very little in the writings and the literature that survives for us of the moderates, unless they write as exiles or outcasts or in secret or something else. All three religions have had times where there has been a domination, we might say, by a fanatic, militant faction of the people. And there have been for all three religions times where moderates have, to an extent, dominated. Something that I remember discussing with somebody after this class or another one is the concept that fanaticism is an easy sell. It's easy to get people impassioned about something that is extreme. This is political, and this is religious, and this is in every philosophy that exists. How do we become impassioned about moderation? Doesn't this, to an extent, violate some aspect of human nature somehow? So you can get extra, extra large and extra, extra small, but medium comes in only one size. There's no extra medium. There's just medium. And how do you get fired up about that? One of the things that we can see in history is that when there is an extent of exposure to different cultures and ideals, when education is popularized as much as possible, at least when it's popularized to the empowered class, there is a tendency and a nature for there to be an extensive mercantile trade, and people are cosmopolitan in their outlook and more interested in profit than persecution. At the same time, we also must remember that early Christianity and early Islam, we don't know that much about early Judaism to make any kind of statement like this about the early Israelites, but for early Christianity and early Islam, there was certainly a tremendous economic motivation for the militant spread of these religions. When we look at a militant theocracy that the Jewish people once had, a very good example, and maybe the only one that survives intact historically, recorded by outside nations as well as our own, rather than being enshrouded in the mythology of Eastern Europe and the little family oligarchies and theocracies that have always existed in Jewish communities, that is of the Hasmonean dynasty, and particularly the early Hasmonean dynasty. One figure stands out predominantly, and this is the very famous Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai was the king of Israel. He was a Kohen. He was a priest. His was halachically an illegal kingship. Kings may only come from the tribe of Judah, from the house of David. But these Hashmonaim led the rebellion, the Maccabean revolt against the Syrian Greeks, and when they gain independence for the Jewish people, they establish a theocracy. There was a generation or two transition until this was firmly implanted, and it becomes truly theocratic in nature. There is an attempt to govern the people by the literal meaning of Torah law. There is the one time where courts attempted actually to put into place, in theory if not in practice, the concept of an eye for an eye. That torts would be settled by damage in kind. If my ox gored you, then I will take a spear and put it through the other person, because that's what the Torah would have us do. There is a lot of discrepancy as to whether any of this was ever implemented, and there is a fair certainty that no genuine eye gouging actually took place. But they tried to implement a literal interpretation of the law. At the same time, the law itself was in the process of development and humanization through what we refer to as the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law that would be committed within a century of this to the first notes that would be the Mishnayot, that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would take a couple of hundred years after that and digest and redact and edit and make into the Mishnah that was the first body universally accepted by the Jewish people as the oral law in written form. It was now being debated, discussed, and developed, and a new Judaism was being developed. A Judaism that would surpass the Greco-Roman world. A body of midrash, of lore, that would certainly eclipse anything the Greco-Roman world had to offer, and would not have a challenge to its richness until the necessary rise of Christianity. And I say necessary because at this point, the traditional, the classic Greco-Roman religions had outlived their usefulness and were no longer relevant to the lives of the people. So was a literal interpretation of Torah. For the literalist, they would say the bracha on the candle Friday afternoon and blow the lights out. Because it says, Lo tivaru esh, you shall have no flame kindling. In a literal interpretation of the Torah, it meant you couldn't leave the light on. You couldn't leave the light burning. And they would stay in darkness. And for those who were literalists in the Babylonian community, I imagine, at least times of the year, in cold through the Sabbath night, through the Friday night. The enlightened Pharisaic or interpretive Jews, who were becoming the predominant ones amongst most classes, and this is perhaps why, more than the destruction of the temple, that Pharisaic Judaism survived, is that it had an appeal to the wealthy and to the noble, and it had an appeal to the peasantry. There was a higher level of understanding, and there was an emunah pshuta, a simple level of understanding. We could see this as a continuum through Judaism throughout the ages, down to our own time. That challenges have come from the oppression of great poverty, from the seduction of great wealth, and that there have always been Jews in all strata of society. No matter how much we view the Jewish people as having been poor and oppressed, we always had a wealthy class. It may have been a very small percentage. They were certainly not evenly spread out. For the time when Chassidut was established in those parts of Eastern Europe that it first clung to, the Jewish people as a whole, the communities as a whole,